So Terry, how do you see the field now and the changes for good or for bad since you began working on disasters, the link with development and vulnerability? How is the field now today?
All right. Well, I think there have been some changes, but they're still challenging against the mainstream, if you like. I think that in the last 20 years or so, the field has become professionalized. So there is now something which is labeled disaster risk reduction, and it's institutionalized and bureaucratized. And in a sense, that's good because it's getting attention, and it wasn't getting much attention before. But I think there's still a lack of understanding of preparedness and prevention. There's an understanding of it and what needs to be done, but it still commands much less of the resources globally. And so I think that's still an argument to be had, is how do we push much more emphasis on preparedness and prevention? And I think that is the if you like, the Cinderella of disaster risk reduction. The first thing to say is about at risk. We got a lot right, I believe, but we also missed out some things. And I think it was a product of its time. It was a product, as I said before, of the need to actually have an understanding that disasters as extreme events had to be seen as being embedded within wider aspects of society, politics, economics, and so on. They should not be seen as isolated physical events. And the second thing is that we emphasized that disasters were not natural, they were socially constructed, and that political, economic systems were what caused people to be vulnerable to natural hazards. So those were the two things, and I think it did a reasonably good job of that. But I think there were two things that were missed out, which since then people have become more aware of, and I've changed in my thinking of it. And the first of those is actually the need for a much deeper understanding of how ordinary people perceive their lives, their livelihoods, and the kind of risks they are exposed to. It's now very clear from a great deal of work done by NGOs and by the Red Cross and the Red Crescent all over the world through vulnerability assessments, because in the last 20 years, if you like, most organizations have developed grassroots ways of understanding risks at the local level. And the Red Cross VCA vulnerability capacity assessment, or all NGOs, practically all NGOs have their own particular brand of these things. And thousands of these studies have been done around the world at the local level. And we have some knowledge of what people say in them. And in almost all cases where organizations go and ask people, what are the problems you face? It's very rare that they mention extreme events. So the flood, the earthquake, the tsunami, the hurricane, the cyclone is not what people are generally worried about. And so what they're worried about is how they put food on the plate next week, how they pay the school fees, they can't afford to buy medicine. In some cases, the roads, so-called accidents of people being injured, killed on the roads, and so on. So their problems of everyday life are the things that they actually worry about mostly. And more severe events are regarded as something which they have to live with. And in many parts of the world, people live with floods. And they are trading off the benefits of living in a place which might have a hazard, a flood, or at the side of a volcano. Millions of people live on the side of volcanoes, some of them active volcanoes, because they get a good life there. They have good soil, they have a good livelihood. So we have this kind of misperception between those outsiders who have knowledge of the hazards, or people like I was who have knowledge of the social construction of the disaster, who think that all of the people share our idea of what is a risk. And what all of this understanding shows is that we have very poor understanding of what people's ideas of the risks they face are. Their primary risk is feeding themselves, clothing the kids, paying for school fees, paying for medicine. Okay, that's their primary risk in life. And to do that, people will have a livelihood which may well be in a dangerous location. There is no shortage of people around the world, whether it's California or Bangladesh, the Delta of Bangladesh, who live in dangerous places because that's where they can get a living. Okay, and I think that what we missed in at risk was this significance of people being willing to face risks, because the risks that we were worried about are not the ones that they are worried about. And I think the problem of disaster risk reduction or disaster risk management is that the risk reduction people are worrying about a risk which is not the primary risk that the people have. So that's the first point. So in the last 10 years or more, I've become extremely interested in how we have a people-centered approach to disaster risk reduction, which may well actually not be looking at the extreme risks to begin with. And we're back to development. We're back to the idea that the best thing that prepares people for disasters is not to have to worry about feeding the children or paying the school fees or paying the doctor. If people are in a situation where they do not have to worry about those basic needs, then they can begin to worry about how they prepare for a cyclone or an earthquake. So the second area is, if people live in these circumstances with the daily threat of a severe risk, but with the daily need to face the need to get a livelihood which enables them to survive and live, how do they then explain the severe risk? And what we find is that the vast majority of people in the world, they may not think that the disaster is natural, but they may think it's God sent or sent by God or gods. They have a cultural and religious interpretation of the danger that they face, which is very helpful, because at least you have an explanation as to why it might happen to you. And given that you have to live with the risk, there you know that an earthquake might happen, you know that a volcano might erupt, whatever. You know that you're living in a floodplain. You live with flood risk. You know that. So then how do you actually constitute your daily life, your lived experience of living in the face of the fact you may face some serious hazard? And what disaster risk reduction has not done, hardly at all, is to include the understanding of people's cultural reasons why they can live with risk. So 2 years ago, I took 8 policy documents, thick books from major disaster risk reduction organizations within the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, UN, DRR, and so on. And I did, in a PDF, you can do a word search. So I searched in these, and it was 1,000 pages. And in these 1,000 pages of policy documents, I searched for the word perception, meaning perception of risk, religion or religious, and culture. Those words did not occur once in those 1,000 pages. So these major mainstream disaster risk organizations are basically completely ignoring one of the principal things, which is how people understand their relationship to hazards. And I think that's shameful. So in the last 10 years, I've been involved with a wonderful group of people, and we've produced 2 books out of it. One of them was actually the Red Cross World Disasters Report in 2014, which is on culture and risk. So we're looking at, well, how do, if we really want to be people-centered in our understanding of how people live with hazards, if we want to be people-centered, we have to understand, why do they live in dangerous places, and how do they explain the risks that they face? What is the point of the cultural explanation, the religious explanation of what they are facing? So that is really the 2 things that I think we were missing in At Risk. A new book might be good, and I hope I can work on it. And so there are other things that I'm working on in recent years with others that build on At Risk and take it to another level.
Okay, I was thinking, listening to your story about perceptions and culture. I mean, so there should be more anthropologists directly engaged in this kind of work, or how would we be able as practitioners or researchers to get a good grasp of what people's perceptions are, because often external agencies have their own, as you rightfully said, have their own perception already before entering a community or a place, and it's often not a really open dialogue with them, and there's a lack of listening ability. Thus, how could we improve the way that NGOs and others work to make sure that we are getting the message that people are saying, and that they say we have this culture of dealing with risk, whereby we on the one hand are aware of the risk we face, but on the other hand we care about our livelihoods and our survival in other fields. How could we improve the work that we're doing to ensure that this is being taken into account?
Yes, it would be great to involve anthropologists, and incidentally, anthropology is the key discipline where a lot of this work has been done, and has been done for quite a long time. People will, I hope, be aware of books by Tony Oliver Smith and Susanna Hoffman and others, which have been doing this for a long time, but they've been rather marginalized in relation to disaster risk reduction. Their work is rarely cited. And as I said, in the policy documents, these issues of culture and religion, perception of risk don't actually come out. So this is quite extraordinary. I think what needs to happen is that people who are engaging in disaster risk reduction, if they still think it should be a kind of a discipline or a specialism, they have to think like anthropologists. They actually, just as I was saying, like hazard specialists, the earthquake specialist must learn to think like a social scientist. It's about understanding the whole way in which a disaster is created by both the social root causes and the hazard itself. So likewise, in relation to culture and belief systems, everyone should be understanding what is going on. So for example, I would say to my students, if you're going somewhere and you're supposedly going to engage in climate change adaptation or disaster risk reduction in this locality, okay, what do you need to understand? So let's say it's a village in Tanzania or a village in Bolivia or Bangladesh. The first thing you have to understand is who runs this place? Who's in control here? And within that, of course, leaving aside class, men are generally in control. So this locality, if you're really seriously interested in gender fairness, equity, and ending of gender oppression of women, then every single place you go, half the people are exploiting the other half of the people. So that's one thing that has to be understood if you're serious about gender issues. The other thing that needs to be understood is what is the class structure, or the caste in some parts of the world, the caste structure of this location. Okay, so it's about that. And then in this location, how do people interpret the risks that they face? And you would have to understand it in quite some detail. So for example, in some amongst many Islamic people, the belief in the religion is that you have a fixed span on earth. Your time on earth is written on a tablet before you're born, and your lifespan is when you die, you've fulfilled your lifespan. Now, unless we understand that, how do we understand how we might engage with people for disaster risk reduction? Because their fundamental understanding of the risk they face is influenced by this idea of the risk and their life and how long their life will be. If you think that and this is very common on volcanoes, not everyone believes it, but many people believe it on volcanoes in Latin America and in other parts of the world. They believe there is a god of the volcano. And about 15 years ago, the DRR specialists in Mexico said, you've got to evacuate from the slopes of Popocatépetl, which is a volcano, big volcano. You can actually, I think, see it from Mexico City. And the advice was that they should evacuate. And this happens quite often now because the science of volcanic eruptions is getting much better. But many of the people, especially those who are indigenous peoples, did not evacuate. And their attitude was that we must make another offering to the god of the volcano, which they did. in a sense, fortunately, but unfortunately, the volcano didn't erupt, so they felt vindicated. And the same happens in other parts of the world. I had a student who did a disaster risk project in Cameroon, on Mount Cameroon, where the attitude to the volcano is very similar. It erupts erratically, but it is dangerous. And the people there did not feel that it was the job of outside scientists to tell them how to live with this volcano, because they had a cultural explanation of the volcano. So everywhere you go, the first thing you should do is, who runs this place? How is it run in terms of class and gender? And how do people themselves understand the risks they live with, how they face those risks? That is partly being an anthropologist, but it's also being a good social scientist, but it's being a good scientist. And we shouldn't have these distinctions. So if a disaster person goes to that place and does not understand all those things, that is not good science.
Okay, but then you're also pleading for the current risk assessment and vulnerability assessment tools to be somehow more politically savvy or culturally savvy. But at the same time, as we know, that it's sometimes quite sensitive to talk about power relations when you enter a community and you ask who's holding power and who's got land and who doesn't got land, who is being marginalized and so on. So how do you balance that sensitivity for culture on the one hand, but then also being able to get the right information at the same time? I mean, we, as a Red Cross specifically, we've experienced that many times, that we have to be quite careful about asking these very direct and sensitive questions about class and power.
Yeah. Well, the first lesson of that is if it's sensitive and difficult, then you know that the power is having some effect which is negative. So that's the first lesson. If people are finding it difficult and you're nervous because you don't want to endanger them, that's the very first thing you need to know, is that there's something going on here, which means we cannot do our job properly because people are fearful of those who hold power. And that's true in many parts of the world. So that's the first lesson, is to understand it and not sweep it under the carpet, as we say, not to ignore it. Now, many of the systems, like the VCA and the Red Cross, many of these local assessment systems have surrogate methods of assessing those systems of power. So you can do a power analysis, or as I used to suggest, don't call it a power analysis, call it an institutional analysis. And you can find various ways in which you lead to the process by which you understand what's going on. And so that is what is essential. And you have to be sensitive to this. So 2 anecdotes about this. 4 years ago or so, some friends of mine did a research project post a big cyclone in Bangladesh. And they used some of these participatory methods to find out what the recovery process was and so on. And in this, they used a standard participatory method of focus group discussion. And in this, they realized, somehow or other, they came to understand that every single person in this focus group discussion was linked to the landowner, the big landowner, the landlord. In effect, the guy and the family that ran the village. Okay, so they realized this was going on. And in fact, they published their paper on it, and they have photographs. It's a fascinating study. They weren't anthropologists, but they, in a sense, they did good science. By doing this, they published the photo of it, and each of them is labeled, showing their relationship to the landlord, the guy that runs this village. Okay, that they weren't an NGO. They could get out. They weren't going to be attacked. But we do know that that is a risk. They're being honest. So back in '76, when I was writing that first paper on disaster risk, a friend of mine in Tamil Nadu, an Indian from there, said, "I want to take you to my home village." Okay, and he spoke very, very good English. He was an English teacher. And so we went to this village on the coast, and we had a lovely day. I swam in the ocean. They picked fresh coconuts. And as it was time to leave, I already knew in this village, this so-called community, that there was tension, because my friend was Christian. The majority in the village were Hindu. And I knew there was tension, severe tension, that had even been violence. Anyway, so he says, oh, we're about to leave. The head of the village has seen us, and I'll have to introduce you. Now, he was Hindu. He didn't speak any English. And my friend said, as I'm leaving, he said, oh, by the way, the reason he's the head of the village is that he owns the most land. So he's the guy that runs this village. He's the guy that if an NGO or the Red Cross went to that village to do a project on disaster risk, he's the one they'd have to talk to before they could even do the project. So in a sense, as soon as you start the project, if that's what you've done, everyone else in the village knows that you're doing it through this guy, who's the boss guy of the village. So whatever you try to do is tainted by this relationship, and you try and do the best you can. Anyway, the point of the story is that my friend was saying into my ear, and I'm shaking hands saying goodbye to this guy. He's the reason he's the head of the village, he's got the most land, and he doesn't work on the land. He employs people, day laborers, to work on the land who get, $1 a day, whatever. And last year, 2 of the people who work for him led a protest against his low wages, and the 2 leaders were killed. And this is typical of these semi-feudal villages all over Asia. It used to be much of Latin America, much less so in Africa. It used to be like this in Europe. The big guy who owned the land had power of life and death over the peasants. So nothing had ever happened to him. He wasn't arrested. He was still there running the village because he was the power. He was the local power. How do you change that? So any intervention there, whether it's the people in Bangladesh, they are then distorted away from what people need by the fact that the powerful have infiltrated. There's a huge literature on it, which my students don't know. Literature going back 30 years on elite capture. This is when the people who have power locally capture the benefits of the project that you do, the disaster risk reduction project, and so on. Very, very well-known phenomenon. Because it's a class-based analysis, students nowadays don't know it, because they're not learning about understanding class. So how you do it is extremely difficult, but the first responsibility we have to good science is to actually understand that it's going on.
Mm-hmm. Then maybe my last question would be about the concept of community. You put it already between brackets, and I know that you've been in the past, you've been quite critical of the term, or at least say that you have to use it in the correct way. Can you maybe elaborate on that? Because this is also part of your legacy, I think, the whole concept of community and how to use it in a respectable way.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Bruno. There's one other topic I would like to come back to if there's time.
Okay.
So let me talk about this. And it's extremely difficult to do it in a few moments. So there is, if people want more depth on it, there is a chapter in the World Disasters Report 2014, which, as you know, is free to download from the IFRC website, which is on this, and it's called The Myth of Community, ? So there is a basic introduction to these ideas there. The basic problem is that if you call a location a community, the immediate assumption is that there is the capacity of the people there to collaborate in a communal way. The word embodies this Latin root of commonality, of being able to do things together. And my point is very simple. In most parts of the world, in that location, the people cannot work together because there are systems of power that organize them into those who have resources, land or not, and those who have few resources. And so, for example, if you went to that Indian village that I just talked about, or the one in Bangladesh, and you set up your community-based disaster risk reduction problem, how does that community work together? And the organization that's doing it is there for a 3-year project maximum. And I've talked to NGO staff, quite a few of them, and we quote some of them in that report. Those NGO staff say, we know that the power exists, but within 3 years, we cannot possibly address that. So we know that the thing that is making people poor and vulnerable is going on, and it will not go away in 3 years of this project. We cannot possibly have an intervention, because the first thing is it might endanger the people who are suppressed within this locality, or we will have other kinds of problems in implementing it if we are seen as champions of them. And there are known cases of where, after a project has finished, those who are in the elite simply go and take away the resources that have been given to the other poorer people. So this notion of community is the assumption that there is equity and communalism amongst those people. And if you ignore the class and gender structure, then that's a problem. Every single so-called community in the world is divided almost equally between half the people who are oppressed and the other half who are the oppressors. And we all pay lip service to gender equity, but in every single so-called community, half the people benefit from the oppression of the other half of the people. So in what sense can we use this term community as meaningful? So I prefer to talk about location or people. Now, actually, this word community is relatively recent, and I've done some investigations of old publications back from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The word community is not used in these are IDS publications, and I hope to do a bit more of a search in other institutions. The word used is people or locality or village. Using the word community brings with it the virtue signaling of the organization from outside, who said, we are going to enable you to collaborate to face your challenge, your disaster risk, whatever. I think it's for our convenience and not for the convenience of the people themselves, because they know they are not in a community. And they would, in most parts of the world, you cannot translate that word. And most people would not choose that word to define the place where they live. If you explained there is this word, community, which we as outsiders bring to you, you know, like you're arriving with a word which they don't use, and you try and translate it, how would you describe the way in which you interrelate with each other in your community? So in the Bangladesh village, the people who have no land would say, I live here when I can. When I don't have any employment, I go to Dhaka and pull a rickshaw. I would like to live here more, but I have no land. Or I've got a tiny plot of land. My son can work this land, but it doesn't bring enough income, so I have to migrate to find work. So, and in that sense, the community is scattered because it is having to find work in different places. In the Delta in Bangladesh, people migrate temporarily, seasonally. They're not in a community, they're having to move because of the problems they face with their livelihood. So it's about being honest again. It's about being honest. If we want to use a word, then it should have meaning which is relevant to the way in which the people themselves live their lives.
But this could differ from one, let's say, geographical region to another. I mean, there's definitely places where there are community centers and people feel like they have some kind of communal spirit. But maybe in certain cultures, the power relations are so strong that so I think it's a bit difficult to generalize based on maybe some South Asian experience to say that the world community has no meaning to many other cultures. But you said you had some last thing to add to our interview.
I'll just respond to that, because in a sense you're right. I mean, many indigenous peoples our word community might be meaningful for many indigenous peoples, so-called tribal peoples in many parts of the world, because they have a collective way of living, and they're mutually, they would not have private property. As soon as you've got private property in a society, some people control more of that property, often land, than other people. And that's a major cause of vulnerability that we've talked about. So of course you could use the word community as outsiders in a meaningful way in some specific circumstances. Most so-called tribal indigenous peoples, if they have food, they don't regard that food as a personal possession. Food is always shared. Everyone who's got food, it's shared. So in that sense, the word community might have meaning. But if we talk about much of Asia, then that is a huge proportion of the world's population in these class and caste-based societies where you do not have equity, where some benefit, and you can't, in my view, you can't use the word community in a meaningful way. And we didn't used to use. Why do we use it now? Because donors like us to talk about community and participation. So it's a funder condition. Latin America, when the Spanish and the Portuguese settled Latin America, they took the feudal system with them. So much of Latin America is divided between large landowners and those who have got very little land at all. And the reason that the Brazilian government has been encouraging poor farmers to go and take over the Amazon and chop down the Amazon to go and farm there is because they lack land in the rest of the place because the big landowners control their land. So it isn't just South Asia. And the other thing to think about is this inequity in land tenure, which incidentally, because you have to understand class, most students do not understand land tenure systems. They don't understand that if you go to a village in Bangladesh or in Bolivia or wherever, that there is a hierarchy of land ownership that's not understood. And this is absolutely crucial to understand that. So yes, there may be some cases where the word community has validity. My problem is that most people do not actually think about why they're using the word community and just use it to make it all look fluffy and cuddly when it isn't. There is conflict going on there, which is sometimes deadly, as in my example from India, and that happens all over. So that's just kind of a bit of an addition. The last thing that I would talk about is that in recent years, there's been a group of us, sort of both pioneers, but others coming up who are younger, who are rethinking disaster risk reduction because we think it's looking at the telescope down the wrong end. What we need to be looking at is disaster risk creation. So what are the forces that make people live in risky places and locations? What are the processes that generate risk from these severe natural hazards? So we've been trying to do a bit of work on this, and we hope to have some publication on it soon. But the idea is that what we have to do is to see how are disasters created. In other words, if we've got the hazard here and the vulnerability there, we need actually much more to look at what is creating that vulnerability. So back here with the root causes and so on, what is making people vulnerable is not accidental. They are not accidental. They are caused by political and economic processes which are making people live in dangerous buildings. Okay, there's basically why do some countries have good building codes and others do not? So what is it that is creating the risk in the countries that do not have good building codes? And that's what we need to look at. Why are people vulnerable? So we need to go back, instead of looking through the lens of disaster risk reduction as if somehow magically we can do a 3-year project and reduce their vulnerability. Let's look at what is causing their vulnerability and see what we have to do to reduce those causes of vulnerability.
And this vulnerability can be caused under the banner of development, like misdevelopment, or under the banner of adaptation, like maladaptation. So we have to be careful that it's not just the governments necessarily who take decisions that increase vulnerability. It could also be some external actors investing in large-scale projects which actually create risk more than reduce it. So
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, a concrete example is every time I go to Dhaka in Bangladesh, I see the Dhaka earthquake disaster being created before my eyes. Now, Dhaka is not regarded as a high earthquake risk, but it is. And I see buildings going up which are not using the proper seismic construction methods. Moreover, much of the development, and this is the class system, developers, powerful business people are encroaching on the wetlands and the lakes to build high-rise apartment buildings for well-off people, rich middle-class people. And by building on these, what in a sense are unconsolidated sediments and lake beds, they are creating the earthquake disaster. These buildings will fall down in the earthquake that comes. And actually, one of the ironies, and we covered this in At Risk a bit, one of the ironies is that when this happens, the majority of people who die will be rich people, as in the Izmir earthquake in Turkey in 1999, because rich people had bought apartment blocks which the cowboy corrupt builders and inspectors had allowed to be constructed against seismic building regulations. And a very large proportion of the people who died in those apartment blocks were middle-class people. They weren't the poorest. So this notion of vulnerability, again, has to be nuanced around what is the vulnerability factor here. So this will be quite an interesting disaster when it happens, because it will not be the kind of stereotype of the poor being the victims of the earthquake.
And is this partly caused by a lack of knowledge on certain standards, or is it really intentionally just greed or just
it's business, it's class, it's business, you could call it greed if you like. You could modify the word greed by saying it's not likely to happen. We all live our lives saying, well, I'm not the one who's going to get heart disease. So you could be the building developer in Bangladesh or anywhere and say, well, I don't think that my building is going to fall down because the earthquake is very unlikely. So it's a high impact but low frequency risk, and people make those judgments all the time. But the building standards are known, and interestingly, on the real estate websites of the companies that sell these apartments, many of them actually claim this apartment has been constructed to withstand a 7.5 Richter earthquake, and they use that as a selling point. But I'm not convinced that they have been, or that the inspector has checked them. And I've seen buildings going up, including luxury hotels, which don't even have something basic like a cross bracing, so that they don't have cross bracing to stop the building swaying in an earthquake. And there is a law in Bangladesh, very famous law, that you must not encroach on wetlands, because these wetlands are actually quite useful for dealing with flood risk. And the wetlands are also good in terms of ecosystem services and water supply and so on. But I think the figure is that in the last 30 years, around 60% of the wetlands of Dhaka have gone. And some of them are under, some of it is under a major university. Mm-hmm. And another is under the building of the Garment Manufacturers and Exporters Association, which the government, which the High Court 10 years ago said had to be demolished and this wetland restored, this lake restored, but it's still there. So this is disaster risk creation.
An interesting term, a new term we have to get used to, disaster risk creation and how to address it. Thank you so much, Terry. It's been very informative, very useful interview. Right. And I'm sure those who will see the interview will fully enjoy it. Thanks so much.